The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Have you ever wondered why we are so often afraid? What causes the unease that follows us, even in the safest of moments? Why does fear feel so pervasive, even when there is no obvious danger? Hello, and welcome back to our channel, Son.Mindfulness. If you're new here, we're so glad you've joined us. In today's video, we're going to dive deep into something we all experience, fear. You might be thinking, I know what fear is. It's the fear of danger, right? Well, that's part of it, but there's a much deeper fear that many of us don't even realize. It's the kind of fear that lurks within us, in our thoughts and emotions, often without us fully understanding why. Right now, many people are overwhelmed by a constant sense of anxiety. With the unpredictability of life, we're constantly worried about the future. This deep-rooted fear affects our peace, our relationships, and even our health. But what if I told you there's a solution, something we can all do to confront and release this fear? It begins by understanding where fear truly comes from, and more importantly, what we can do about it. That's exactly what we're exploring today. Fear doesn't always come from the outside world. In fact, much of the fear we feel is born from within. It arises when we cling to the idea of a fixed, permanent self. A self that is threatened by change. From a Buddhist perspective, this is where fear truly originates. From ignorance. Ignorance about the impermanence of life, the impermanence of who we think we are. Once we understand this truth, fear begins to lose its grip on us. We'll delve into this more in the video. By understanding fear from a Buddhist point of view, you'll be able to navigate life with greater peace, knowing that fear, while natural, doesn't have to control you. You may wonder, why is this important? In a world filled with uncertainties, fear can feel like a constant companion. But once we begin to understand its root causes, we gain control over it. Understanding fear gives us the tools to let go of what holds us back, allowing us to experience life with more joy and freedom. It's about understanding that we don't have to live in fear. And by doing so, we open ourselves to a life of greater peace and purpose. Here at Son.Mindfulness, we aim to share simple yet profound teachings to help you live a more mindful and balanced life. Our videos are designed to provide insights and tools that you can incorporate into your daily routine to reduce stress and increase happiness. If you find this content helpful, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us continue creating content focused on health, mindfulness, and personal growth. We're honored to have you with us on this journey. Now that we've laid the foundation, it's time to dive deeper into today's topic. Understanding the root of our fears will give us the power to transform them. Stay with us until the end of the video as we explore the Buddhist perspective on fear and how we can confront it in our everyday lives. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Let's get started. Part 2. Fear arises from attachment to the self. The concept of self in Buddhism. In Buddhism, the self is often described as an illusion. It is not a fixed, permanent entity. Rather, it is a collection of ever-changing thoughts, memories, and experiences. We often think of ourselves as stable, unchanging beings. But the Buddha teaches that this perception is incorrect. We hold on to the idea of self throughout our lives. We identify with our bodies, our roles, and our experiences. But when we observe closely, we see that the self is fluid. It is constantly shifting with time, circumstances, and experiences, and yet we cling to it as if it is solid. This attachment to the self is the source of much of our fear. The illusion of self. A source of fear. The Buddha teaches that attachment to an illusionary self creates fear. We fear aging because we identify ourselves with our bodies. When we look in the mirror and see signs of aging, we become anxious. We fear losing our appearance, our vitality, and our strength. But these are just temporary states. Our bodies are constantly changing. Consider the great warrior, General Kato Kiyomasa. He was once a powerful figure in his youth. But as he grew older, he feared the loss of his strength. His fear wasn't about dying, it was about losing the identity he had built. This fear of loss, of change, is rooted in his attachment to a fixed sense of self. Similarly, we fear being forgotten. We identify with our reputation, our accomplishments, and our roles in life. When these are threatened, we feel threatened. We fear that without these, we no longer exist as we know ourselves. We also fear change. Change challenges the stability of our self. When something unexpected happens, like a change in health or relationships, we panic. Our sense of who we are is disrupted. But why do we fear change so much? Because it threatens our attachment to a stable self. When we are forced to confront change, we realize that we cannot control it. This makes us feel vulnerable, insecure, and fearful. Real-life examples. In daily life, we are constantly reminded to identify with the self. Society asks us, "Who are you? What have you done?" These questions focus on our status, our achievements, and our possessions. We are conditioned to tie our worth to these external factors. When we lose them, we feel as if we lose part of ourselves. For example, consider the story of a successful business owner. Before the collapse of their company, they were known for their wealth and power. But after the loss, they feel lost. They no longer have the same identity. They are no longer the successful entrepreneur. Their fear of losing everything comes from their attachment to this identity. This attachment is not just to money or status, it's to the self they have created. When this self is threatened, they feel a deep fear. We all experience this to some degree. How many of us identify with our jobs, our names, or our possessions? We fear change because it means losing our sense of who we are. Why we fear change? The fear of change arises because change disrupts the stability of the self. We become comfortable with the way things are. We like to believe that we are in control of our lives. But life is always changing. Nothing stays the same forever. The Buddha taught that everything is impermanent. This includes the self we cling to. Change is a natural part of life, but it can be difficult to accept. The fear of change is rooted in our attachment to the idea of a fixed, unchanging self. When we resist change, we are really resisting the flow of life. We want things to stay the same, but life moves forward, with or without our consent. Buddhist teachings encourage us to confront this fear. We can confront it by understanding that our self is not permanent. It is always changing, just like everything else in life. Moving beyond attachment. To overcome fear, we must recognize that the self is impermanent. We must let go of our attachment to a fixed identity. This doesn't mean abandoning who we are. Rather, it means understanding that our identity is not permanent. By releasing our attachment to the self, we can free ourselves from fear. The more we cling to an unchanging self, the more we are bound by fear. When we understand that everything is impermanent, we can embrace change. Change becomes less threatening when we let go of the need for control. We don't have to fear aging, change, or loss. We can live more freely when we stop clinging to an illusionary self. As we begin to understand that the self is not as permanent as we once thought, we can start to let go of the fear it causes. But how can we truly understand the nature of fear itself, and how to live without being controlled by it? Let's explore this further in the next section. Understanding the nature of fear, a Buddhist perspective. Part 3. Understanding the nature of fear, a Buddhist perspective. Buddhist view of fear. Fear is a common and powerful emotion. It arises in response to a perceived threat or uncertainty. In Buddhism, fear is not seen as a random occurrence. It is deeply connected to our attachment to a fixed, permanent self. The Buddha teaches that everything in life is impermanent. This includes our sense of self. We often view ourselves as unchanging, fixed beings. But this perception is an illusion. We hold on to the idea of self throughout our lives. We identify with our bodies, our roles, and our experiences. However, when we observe closely, we see that this self is not fixed. It is fluid, constantly changing with time and circumstances. Yet we cling to it as if it were permanent. This attachment is the root cause of fear. We fear aging, illness, and death because we see these changes as threats to the self. But the self we cling to is always changing. It is not something that can be held on to permanently. The role of ignorance in fear. The Buddha teaches that the root of all fear is ignorance. But what does ignorance mean in Buddhism? It is not just a lack of knowledge. Ignorance is the failure to recognize the true nature of life. We fail to see that everything is impermanent, including our self. We cling to the illusion that there is a permanent I, a fixed identity. This misunderstanding causes fear. We fear the loss of our identity, our memories, and our status. But when we understand that everything is impermanent, including the self, fear begins to diminish. Consider a well-known figure, the monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who often spoke about fear. He said, "Fear is not a bad thing, it's a signal." Fear shows us where we are attached, where we cling to the illusion of permanence. When we understand that fear arises from ignorance, we can begin to release our attachment to a fixed self. The Buddha's teachings help us recognize the impermanence of all things. With this awareness, fear loses its power over us. Steps to confront fear in Buddhism. How do we confront fear according to Buddhism? The first step is letting go. Letting go is a key practice in Buddhism. It means releasing our attachment to the idea of a permanent self. This practice does not mean abandoning who we are. It means understanding that our identity is not fixed. When we let go of our attachment to a solid self, we free ourselves from fear. The more we cling to the self, the more fear we experience. By practicing letting go, we can live more freely, without the constant grip of fear. In the teachings of Zen Master Dogen, he said, "When you sit in meditation, let go of everything, even the idea of yourself." This practice of letting go is central to overcoming fear in Buddhist practice. Mindfulness practice. Another essential step in confronting fear is mindfulness. Mindfulness is the practice of being fully present in the moment. When we are mindful, we observe our thoughts, emotions, and fears without judgment. We do not try to change them or run away from them. Instead, we simply notice them. When fear arises, we become aware of the physical sensations in our bodies. We notice the tension, the rapid heartbeat, or the racing thoughts. By observing fear with mindfulness, we prevent it from controlling us. We understand that fear is not something permanent. It is just a passing feeling. In Buddhist teachings, mindfulness is often compared to watching a wave rise and fall. The wave appears and disappears, but the ocean remains. Similarly, fear comes and goes, but the true self remains unchanged. Mindfulness helps us see that we are not our fear. We are not the self we are afraid of losing. We are simply part of the ever-changing flow of life. By practicing letting go and mindfulness, we can begin to see fear for what it truly is, a temporary experience that does not define us. As we embrace these practices, we release our attachment to the illusion of a permanent self. But how does this understanding help us when faced with the fear of death? Let's explore this in the next section, Death and Fear, Uncovering the Deeper Fear. Part 4. Death and Fear, Uncovering the Deeper Fear. The fear of death. The fear of death is something we all encounter. It is a fear that often lingers in the background of our lives. We hear the word death, and immediately a sense of discomfort arises. But what exactly are we afraid of? In Buddhist philosophy, the fear of death is not only about the physical end of life. It is about the fear of losing the self that we've built up over time. We define ourselves by our accomplishments, roles, and experiences. Our identities are shaped by the relationships we form and the lives we lead. But death threatens all of these. When we face death, we fear that everything we've held on to, our identity, our role, our reputation, will be lost. This fear is born from our attachment to the self. We cling to this illusion of permanence, thinking that the I will live forever. Yet, the Buddha's teachings remind us that everything is impermanent. Death is simply the natural end of one cycle and the beginning of another. The illusion of the permanent self. The fear of death arises because we mistakenly believe that we are permanent beings. We think of ourselves as solid, unchanging, and separate from the world. But the Buddha teaches us that the self is not permanent. Our thoughts, feelings, and even our memories are constantly shifting. They are not fixed entities. In reality, there is no separate, permanent self that we can cling to. This is the core teaching of anatta, non-self, which states that the self is an illusion. The self is not a permanent, isolated entity but a collection of impermanent parts. As the great Zen master, Shunryu Suzuki, once said, "The self is like a shadow. It is always shifting and never fixed." The fear of death, then, is rooted in our attachment to a false idea of self. It is the belief that something permanent exists within us that must be preserved. But once we understand that there is no permanent self, the fear of death begins to lose its grip on us. A story of acceptance. Consider the story of a wise monk in Thailand named Ajahn Chah. Ajahn Chah spent much of his life teaching others about the impermanence of life and death. One day, a student asked him, "Master, are you afraid of dying?" Ajahn Chah smiled and replied, "I am not afraid of dying. I have already died." The student was puzzled. Ajahn Chah continued, "I died to my attachments. I died to my ideas of who I am and what I need. I have accepted that life is fleeting and death is part of it, so there is nothing to fear." This acceptance of impermanence and death is at the heart of Buddhist wisdom. Ajahn Chah's words remind us that when we let go of the illusion of a permanent self, we can begin to embrace life and death with peace. Facing the fear of death with mindfulness. The Buddha taught that mindfulness is key to overcoming the fear of death. Mindfulness allows us to observe our thoughts and fears without judgment. We don't try to suppress them or escape from them. We simply notice them and accept them as part of the natural flow of life. When we practice mindfulness, we become more aware of the present moment. We stop focusing on the future or the unknown, like death. We recognize that life is happening now, in this moment, and death is just another part of the cycle. In this way, we can come to see that death is not something to fear. It is simply another natural event that flows within the great web of life. The great teacher, Pema Chodron, said, "We think that by avoiding fear, we will somehow overcome it. But it's only by acknowledging fear that we truly begin to find peace. The peace of letting go." Ultimately, the fear of death is tied to our attachment to the self. When we let go of this attachment, we realize that we are not our bodies or our roles. We are not defined by what we do or what we own. We are part of something much greater, life itself. Death in this light becomes just another step in the flow of existence. It is not an end, but a transition. Once we accept the impermanence of all things, including ourselves, fear begins to diminish. We can then approach death not with dread, but with a sense of peace and acceptance. As the Buddha said, the wise person sees death as a friend, a companion, and not an enemy. Now that we understand the deep connection between fear and death, we can begin to release our attachment to the self. But how do we live our lives with peace, free from fear, even as death continues to approach? Let's explore the next section: what dies and what stays. Part 5. What dies and what stays. What actually dies? When we speak of death, it often feels final. It's a word that carries heavy meaning. We envision the end of a life, the cessation of all that once was. But what exactly dies? In Buddhism, the concept of death is not as straightforward as it may seem. We often think of death as the end of the person, the final curtain that falls on life. But the Buddha's teachings offer a different perspective. Death, from the Buddhist point of view, is not the end of a permanent, unchanging soul. Rather, death is the dissolution of the aggregates, our body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. These aggregates come together in a temporary way to form the self. When death occurs, it is not the end of a permanent me, but the disintegration of the elements that form our temporary identity. This dissolution is a natural process, much like a wave rising and falling in the ocean. The wave is real for a moment, but it returns to the ocean. It does not cease to exist, it simply returns to the larger flow of life. Similarly, when we die, we do not disappear completely, but rather return to the continuous cycle of existence. The concept of impermanence and continuity. Buddhism teaches the principle of anicca, or impermanence. This means that everything in life, including ourselves, is in a constant state of flux. We are not solid, unchanging beings, but ever-evolving processes. When death comes, it simply marks the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. The true essence of who we are is not tied to a particular body or identity. Instead, our true nature is connected to the greater flow of life. In this sense, death is not an end, but a transition, an integral part of the ongoing cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Consider the example of a candle flame. When you light a candle, it flickers for a time, giving off light. But the flame is not a permanent entity. It is a process, a flow of energy. When the candle is extinguished, the flame disappears. Yet the energy it carried is not lost, it simply transforms into another form. Similarly, when we die, our self as we know it may cease to exist, but the energy of our actions, thoughts, and intentions continues on in the form of karma. The results of our actions. The role of karma in continuity. Karma, a central teaching in Buddhism, is the law of cause and effect. Our actions, words, and thoughts create ripples that affect not only ourselves but the world around us. Karma doesn't die with the body, it continues on through the cycle of life. When we live mindfully and compassionately, we create positive karma, which carries forward, influencing future lives and the lives of others. This is where continuity happens. Though the body may die, the actions we have taken, the kindness we have shown, and the wisdom we have gained continue to shape the world. In this sense, there is no true end to us. There is only the transformation of energy. The example of a river. To understand this more clearly, imagine a river. At any moment, the river may seem to be one continuous body of water. But in reality, the river is made up of countless molecules of water that are constantly flowing and changing. At no point is the river the same water. The water flows, it changes, and yet the river continues to exist. In the same way, we are not a fixed, unchanging self. We are a process, a flow of moments, experiences, and actions. When we die, it is as if we are part of a river that continues to flow, regardless of the change in the water. We are part of a much larger, interconnected reality. What stays? If what we call the self is not permanent, then what is it that remains? The Buddha taught that while our identity and our body may change, there is a deeper, unchanging truth within us. This truth is not something we can point to or name. It is the nature of life itself, the awareness, the consciousness, the interconnectedness that exists beyond individual identities. It is this essence that continues beyond death, not as an individual self, but as part of the larger flow of existence. When we let go of our attachment to the illusion of a permanent I, we connect to something greater, something vast and unchanging. This is the peace that the Buddha spoke of, a peace that transcends life and death. It is the understanding that life is not about holding on to a fixed identity, but about living fully in each moment, embracing life and death. Once we understand that the self is impermanent, we begin to embrace both life and death with greater peace. Death becomes less frightening because we no longer see it as the end of a permanent me. Instead, we see it as part of the natural process, an inevitable part of the ever-changing cycle of existence. As the famous Zen master Suzuki Roshi said, "We live in a world that is always changing." So, in the end, death is not something to fear. It is simply part of the process. Having explored the nature of death, the question now becomes, how do we live, knowing that nothing is permanent? How do we embrace both life and death with wisdom and compassion? Let's continue our journey in the next section. Death as a teacher. 6. Death as a teacher. The role of death in Buddhist practice. In many cultures, death is a subject that is often avoided or feared. It's something we try not to think about, hoping that if we ignore it, it won't affect us. But in Buddhism, death is not something to be feared. It is something to be understood, embraced, and even celebrated. The Buddha saw death as a natural part of life, not as an end, but as a transition. For the Buddha, mindfulness of death was a crucial part of the spiritual path. This practice, known as maranasati, or mindfulness of death, invites us to reflect on our mortality regularly. By acknowledging death as an inevitable part of life, we can live more fully. The awareness of our impermanence encourages us to make each moment meaningful. When we remember that our time is limited, we become more present, more compassionate, and more aware of the preciousness of life. A teaching from the Buddha. The Buddha often spoke about the impermanence of life to his disciples. He encouraged them not to be afraid of death, but to use the awareness of death to fuel their spiritual growth. In one famous teaching, the Buddha said, "Remember that you are going to die, and then live accordingly." This simple yet profound statement encourages us to live fully, without fear or attachment. When we live with the understanding that our time is limited, we begin to prioritize what truly matters. We stop chasing after empty desires or worldly distractions. We become more focused on cultivating wisdom, compassion, and kindness. In this way, death becomes a teacher, a reminder that we should not waste time on things that do not bring peace or happiness. The wisdom of acceptance. As we come to accept death as a natural part of life, we also begin to understand the value of living mindfully. Death teaches us that everything we hold dear, our possessions, our reputation, our relationships, are all impermanent. This doesn't mean we should stop caring about these things. Rather, we should care without clinging to them. By embracing the transient nature of life, we can love more deeply, live more fully, and let go more easily. The great teacher Thich Nhat Hanh spoke about this acceptance beautifully. He said, "When you are aware of your own impermanence, you begin to live your life with an open heart. You love more freely, and you are no longer afraid of loss." This teaching invites us to be free from fear, not by avoiding death, but by understanding it. By accepting death, we are no longer bound by the fear of losing what we cannot keep. Letting go of fear. One of the main reasons people fear death is the attachment to the self and to life as we know it. We fear the unknown, the end of the things we cherish, and the dissolution of the identity we have created. But the Buddha teaches us that true freedom comes when we let go of this attachment. When we let go of our attachment to a fixed, permanent self, we become free. The fear of death is just another form of attachment. It is the attachment to our physical body, our role in the world, our possessions, and even our memories. When we let go of these attachments, we can face death with peace and acceptance. As the Taoist philosopher Chuang Tzu once said, "Life and death are one thread, the same line viewed from different sides." Chuang Tzu's teaching reflects the Buddhist view. Life and death are not opposites. They are two sides of the same coin. Death is not something to be feared, but something to be understood and embraced as part of the natural flow of life. Death as a source of liberation. In Buddhism, the practice of dying before you die is not about physically dying. It is about letting go of the false self, the ego, the desires, and the attachments that bind us. The true liberation comes when we no longer cling to the self. This is the essence of abhaya, the fearless state of mind that arises from the understanding of impermanence and non-self. When we let go of fear and attachment, we experience freedom. This freedom allows us to live authentically, without the burden of clinging to an illusionary sense of self. It is only through this understanding that we can experience the ultimate peace, the peace that comes when we live in full awareness of our mortality. The Zen master Hakuin once said, "To die before you die is to be free from death." When we can live with this awareness, we stop running from life and death. We embrace each moment with clarity and purpose, finding peace in the face of death. As we continue to reflect on death, we come to see that it is not something to fear. It is not the end, but simply another transition in the endless cycle of birth, life, and rebirth. By accepting death, we let go of the fear that controls us. We become free to live fully, without attachment. This peace is not something we acquire after death, but something we cultivate throughout our lives. When we face our fears, whether it is the fear of death, loss, or the unknown, we are no longer controlled by them. Instead, we find liberation. As the Buddha said, the one who is truly free is not afraid of death. Now that we understand death as a teacher, we can begin to live in a way that reflects this deep understanding. By letting go of the fear of death and embracing its lessons, we open ourselves to a deeper peace. But how do we live with this new understanding of impermanence? Let's explore this further in the next section. No death, no fear, the ultimate freedom. Conclusion: no death, no fear, the ultimate freedom. As we journey through life, we often find ourselves shackled by fear. It may be fear of the unknown, fear of loss, or the fear of death. These fears can weigh heavily on our hearts, clouding our ability to live freely. But the Buddha offers a profound truth. Freedom from fear comes not by avoiding it, but by understanding it. In Buddhism, true freedom is found when we release our attachment to a permanent self. When we recognize that we are not the fixed, solid identity we imagine, fear loses its grip. Understanding the impermanence of all things allows us to live without fear, embracing each moment with peace and clarity. The more we let go of our attachment to a self that we believe is unchanging, the more we come into alignment with the flow of life. And in this flow, there is freedom. Freedom to experience life fully, without the constant weight of fear. At the heart of our fears is the belief in a permanent self. We fear death because we think it marks the end of who we are. But the Buddha teaches that there is no fixed self. The self is a collection of thoughts, memories, and experiences, all impermanent. When we let go of this illusion of a permanent self, death loses its power to frighten us. The essence of Buddhist freedom is freedom from the self. We are not defined by our roles, our bodies, or our achievements. When we understand that our true nature is beyond these temporary identities, we can live with ease. In the absence of fear, we find the freedom to live with wisdom, compassion, and joy. And death, rather than being an end, becomes a natural part of the endless cycle of life. When we embrace the impermanent nature of life and death, we begin to live without fear. The more we let go of our attachment to the idea of a permanent self, the more we are free to experience life as it is. Life is not about clinging to a fixed identity or fearing what we cannot control. It is about understanding that all things, including ourselves, are part of an ever-changing process. As we come to accept death as a natural transition, we free ourselves from the fear that binds us. We realize that there is no permanent self to die, and with this understanding, we find peace. Living with this awareness allows us to live more fully, more authentically, and with a deep sense of gratitude for each moment. Thank you for taking the time to explore these teachings. I sincerely hope you found value and insight in the journey we've shared. Remember, the path to freedom from fear begins with understanding. I encourage you to reflect on these teachings and apply them in your daily life. Start by embracing impermanence, letting go of attachments, and living more mindfully. The more you practice, the more you will experience the peace and freedom that come with letting go of fear. If you found this content meaningful, please consider subscribing to the Son.Mindfulness channel. Your support helps keep these teachings flowing. Feel free to share your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. May you always be healthy, peaceful, and happy. And may you be blessed with good fortune on your journey through life. Thank you.